Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. Tonight, I will be reading Chapter 9. Wysteria, Chapter 9. Will did wake up before and next to Emily. He rolled onto his side and faced her, but remembering what she told him before falling asleep, made sure not to disturb her. What would happen if I woke her up, he wondered, staring at her lovely face, eyes closed tight, with a hint of a smile on her lips. Though he had a strong impulse to stroke her hair and kiss her on the cheek, he resisted the urge. He thought about what she'd said, that they would be dreaming in reverse. What normally happens when you wake someone who's dreaming, he asked himself. If he now woke Emily, bringing her mind back to this sleeping body, would her waking body, back home, fall asleep? Wow, he thought. I guess that could be pretty dangerous. Will considered the times he'd nearly dozed off while driving late at night. Emily finally began to stir. She rolled onto her back and stretched her arms above her head, then took a deep breath and slowly opened her eyes. "Good morning," Will greeted her. "Rise and shine." "Hi there," she said softly with a sleepy smile. "So how was your day?" he asked, laughing. Emily giggled. "Pretty worthless. I was tired and spacey." Will had experienced the same thing, feeling fuzzy-headed, though he'd had plenty of sleep. And it's a little unsettling walking around knowing that you have this other body lying asleep in another universe. But isn't that exactly what happens every night, Will remarked. We walk around here all day long, knowing that our bodies are in bed back home. Yes, she said, but that's one of the things that makes this just a dream. No matter how real, no matter how stable, we know that our waking body is always back there, even when our mind travels here. The waking world has that physical continuity. That's why it's the real world. Being here is always temporary, no matter how regularly we return. At least for most of us. Emily sat up and looked at her hands. "This is weird," she said. "What is?" he asked. "My body. It feels different." She then stood and walked around the room, occasionally shaking her arms and legs. "It is strange to think that this body was here all night, without me." "Yes," he said. "It does seem to blur the reality line, doesn't it?" Will got up from the bed and stretched. Then, together, they walked out onto the balcony and over to the railing, where they stood for a time, taking in the view. The towering cliffs from which the waterfall hung, the deep gorge into which it tumbled, the forest blanketing the hills that rolled far into the distance. "So," said Will, "while you were sleeping, I thought about what you said, that I shouldn't wake you. Am I correct in assuming that if I did, your waking body would fall asleep?" "Yes," she replied. "As you can imagine, that could be a problem." "Would you wake up immediately, no matter where you were?" he asked. Emily thought for a moment. Not necessarily, she said. As I understand it, there would be a tug-of-war between the two bodies, both trying to take possession of the mind. The waking body would fight to stay awake, especially if falling asleep were dangerous, while the dream body would try to wake up. What determines which world wins in the end? I suppose it depends on the situation, she answered. Survival instinct would play a part. Before Will could question her further about the subject, he heard the tolling of bells, like large church bells, coming from the direction of the town. I've never heard that before, he said. Is there a bell tower in the town, she asked. I don't remember seeing one. Not that I know of, he responded, as the bells continued ringing. That's odd. They sound like warning bells, she said. Yes, said Will, they do. I need to go see what's going on. I'm not sure how long this will take. Do you want to wait here? Of course not, she replied. I'm coming with you. They left the castle and, at a quick walk, made their way through the woods. Reaching the garden, they broke into a jog and soon came to the stairway leading to the main gate. But as they began climbing the steps, Will suddenly halted, for the bells had fallen silent. They stopped, said Emily. Yes, he said, but something doesn't feel right. Then, Will heard loud voices, shouts, coming from the street outside the doors. He dashed up the stairs and out into the intersection, where he saw several people running his way. What's going on, Will? Asked Emily, catching up to him. I'm not sure, he said. As they moved up the street toward the square, Will stopped one of the men who ran by. What's wrong? He asked him. Strangers in the town, sir, the townsman frantically answered before scurrying off. Then, coming from within the plaza, Will heard the sound of glass breaking and a woman's scream. He ran to the gateway and peered inside. There, he saw two men, strangers, dressed in long brown leather coats, clearly not citizens of his world. One of them held a club in his hand and was shattering windows at the opposite end of the square. The other was walking toward a well-dressed couple who clung to each other as they slowly backed away from him. Will started to step forward, but Emily caught his arm from behind. No, Will, she said, pulling him back. Don't. Are they drifters? He asked. Yes, said Emily, and there are two of them. Just let them be. They'll leave soon. You can fix anything they break, can't you? I suppose so. But it's not right. They shouldn't be allowed to come into another person's world and destroy things, he said, watching the thug break another window. Maybe not, Will, but is that what you want to do with your time here? Fight? Do you want to play with bullies or with me? She grasped both his hands and looked into his eyes. Just let the bad children play. You wouldn't be teaching them a lesson if that's what you're thinking. That type will never learn. He took a deep breath and relaxed his body. Maybe she was right. Suddenly, there was another scream. Will turned and saw that the drifter who was menacing the couple now had them backed up against the wall, while the other hooligan was coming over to join his friend. As the lady began to cry, the gentleman stepped in front of her and took a defensive posture. The villain laughed, then took a step forward and struck the man in the face with his fist, sending him to the ground. The woman shrieked again. "Sorry, Emily, that's it," said Will, disengaging himself from her grasp. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to stop them," he said. "I can't let them assault my people." "But those men can hurt you, Will," she said imploringly. "I'll be okay," he replied with a wink. "Please, stay here." Will turned and began marching across the square. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he called out, trying to draw the drifters' attention away from the terrified woman, whom both assailants were now closing in on. The two men stopped and looked in his direction, clearly surprised at the interruption. The stricken citizen got up from the ground, took his lady by the hand, and led her inside the nearest doorway. "Can I help you with something?" Will said in a firm voice, continuing to move straight toward them with long, resolute strides. "I still think this is a mistake," said Emily, who was following at his heels, trying to keep up. "I thought I asked you to wait back there," he said to her, slowing his pace slightly, while still keeping his eyes fixed on the two strangers. "Are you kidding?" she said. "Emily, there's no way, Will." "Okay," he whispered, realizing he had no choice but to give in. "At least stay behind me. Do you understand? It's important that you keep out of the way." When they came within a few yards of the intruders, who still seemed taken off guard, Will stopped. Emily started to step up next to him, but he held out his arm, keeping her slightly behind him. The drifter who'd struck the gentleman turned and took a step toward Will, then stopped. He was older than his partner, at least in his late 40s, with a weathered face and close-cropped hair. He had a thin build and stood slightly shorter than Will. The younger man, perhaps still in his 20s, had long blonde hair, a very light complexion, and was tall and rather stocky. The elder scoundrel stared at Will for several seconds, as if sizing him up. "So, this is your place, I take it," he said, sneering. "Yes, it is," said Will. "Well, we're just sightseeing," he said. "So why don't you and your little plaything just run along?" "Moron," muttered Emily, under her breath, but loud enough for the man to hear. "What's that, girl?" he said, taking another step in their direction. He stared at Emily for a moment, then addressed Will. "Better tell your little toy to watch her smart mouth." "Okay, I think you need to leave. Now," Will told him, keeping one eye on the younger man, who stood a little farther away and to Will's right, still holding the club he was using to break the windows. Their rude and unruly guest seemed about to respond, but then he paused and looked again at Emily, squinting slightly, scrutinizing her. "Wait a minute," he said suddenly. "I've seen her before. Isn't she the pretty traveler that Nathan has a thing for?" he asked his companion. That's her, the blond-haired man replied, taking a couple of steps to his left, as if trying to circle behind Will. I should have guessed. They're Nathan's goons, said Emily disdainfully. Who's Nathan? Will asked. Someone you don't want to mess with, answered the older drifter, taking another small step closer to them. He's a dreamer, a real nutcase, she responded. You think so, do you? The man shot back. Maybe we should take you with us, and you can tell him that to his face. Yes, he'd be real happy to see you, I think. You're pathetic, she said, stepping up next to Will. You can travel anywhere in the universe you want, and you two actually choose to be toadies to that perverted lunatic. Outraged, the man lunged forward, his right arm reaching for Emily. But before he could touch her, Will shifted between them and struck the attacker's right shoulder with his fist. The impact knocked the man back a step. His arm went limp and fell to his side. Grasping his wounded shoulder with his left hand, he let out a howl. Consider that a warning shot, said Will. Then, catching movement out of the corner of his eye, Will turned and saw the other drifter rushing toward them, his arm raised, club in hand, preparing to deliver a downward blow. Instinctively, Will started to step to one side, but he realized this would leave Emily exposed and within the attacker's reach. Instead, he moved toward the oncoming assailant, dropped low, and drove his fist into the man's lower abdomen, just below his navel. Will spun to one side as the young drifter doubled over and fell forward onto the ground, nearly at Emily's feet. He lay there on his side, hugging his stomach with both arms and gasping for air. Then he moaned and began to vomit. Yuck, cried Emily as she jumped back a few steps. The downed man managed to get to his hands and knees. You're going to pay for that, my friend, he said, grimacing in pain. But not on this night. His solid figure began dissolving, and then he was gone. He sure wanted to get out of that body, said Emily, laughing. I guess I don't blame him. That must have hurt. Will then turned to the remaining stranger, who stood with his mouth open, looking stunned. Now, where were we? He said, taking a step toward the man. I believe I was trying to explain to you and your friend that you weren't welcome here. I'm sure there are plenty of other worlds you can play in, places where your sense of entertainment might be tolerated, even appreciated. Will paused and looked straight into the man's eyes. But you can't play here anymore. For a moment, the wounded intruder seemed to consider making a stand. He narrowed his eyes and clenched both his fists, but then winced in pain. Taking a deep breath, he stared at Will. Not on this night, he said, echoing his partner's last words. But I will see you again, boy. He then looked at Emily. And I'll be sure to tell Nathan you send him your regards, he added, flashing a malevolent grin. The gaunt drifter backed away from them, Sweet dreams, he said. His figure began to fade, stretching and distorting as it turned to vapor, then vanished. And thank you for joining me tonight, and we will be back very shortly with Chapter 10.